Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. As you know, today's webinar is part of the International Affairs webinar series, which is part of from Chatham House and Chatham House academic journal, International Affairs. Now, my name is Leah Dehaan. I'm a junior editor for the journal and I will also be today's chair. Now, let me turn to introducing today's speaker, Professor Daniel Drezner. He is Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Professor Drezner's recent International Affairs article is entitled Immature Leadership, Donald Trump and the American Presidency, and this will also be the topic of today's webinar. I should also add that the article is free to access, and I will be adding a link in the in the chat function below so that everyone can access it. Thank you ever so much for joining us today, Professor Drezner.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thank you to everyone for coming. I'm going to share my screen and give a brief PowerPoint presentation. Essentially, what inspired the article was an ongoing debate within the United States about whether or not we should think of the presidency as a strong institution or a weak institution in terms of the ability of the president to do whatever they want. And there's always been, for the last 50 or so odd years, there's been two contending schools of thought, basically. The first articulates the presidency as a weak institution. And this is best exemplified by Richard Newstadt's book, Presidential Power, in which Newstadt said, among other things, inform all presidents are leaders nowadays. In fact, this guarantees no more that they will be clerks. And this has been a strain of thought going up into 2016 in terms of Howell and Moe's work. And the reason for this is the belief that while the presidency presumably has certain powers enumerated under the Constitution, there are a variety of checks on what the president can do through the Constitution, through statutes, and through informal institutions and norms. And since the Constitution was designed to make sure that there was a separation of powers, a variety of institutions ranging from Congress to the judicial branch to the bureaucracies within the federal government and more general norms of presidential behavior and presidential politics all would essentially cosset the president within a relatively narrow range of behavior, which doesn't mean that the president has no power, but rather that the president has to constantly bargain and persuade others in order to be able to do anything possible. The contrary school of thought, which is best exemplified by Arthur Schlesinger, says that essentially the presidency is, in point of fact, an imperial institution. That in truth, while in theory, there are a variety of checks on presidential power, as Schlesinger wrote in The Imperial Presidency, confronted by presidential initiatives in foreign affairs, Congress and the courts, along with press and the citizenry, often lack confidence in their own information and judgment and are likely to be intimidated by executive authority. And indeed, many of Schlesinger's heirs in terms of making this argument have extended the argument to include not just foreign policy, but also domestic policy. That essentially, because the president is a single individual and because of the sort of very strong theory of the unitary executive that's embedded both within the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and legal jurisprudence of 2 centuries, the president has a unique advantage compared to all of the other institutions that I talked about in terms of constraining them. And this is why the guardrails are weak, that Congress in the end winds up being 535 individuals compared to the president's 1. The courts traditionally defer to the executive and indeed develop doctrines to avoid getting involved in power disputes between Congress and the executive branch. The bureaucracy has learned, or presidents have learned over time, long before Trump, to essentially bring the bureaucracy to heel if they feel like it's acting in an untoward manner. And norms essentially are what we make of them. And norms have been eroding, you can argue, within the US political discourse as partisanship has risen. This debate, in some ways, Donald Trump is tailor-made for this because he is the greatest natural experiment, you can argue, in American history on this, in no small part because his personal psychology renders him a poor leader in many ways. And the question is he still a powerful president? And so this was the topic of the paper that I published in International Affairs, and I am again very grateful to Chatham House for that. And that paper was, in some ways, an extract from a book published by University of Chicago Press titled "The Toddlerinchief: What Donald Trump Teaches Us About the Modern Presidency." Now, this is a rather strong statement to make in peer-reviewed discourse, that the president essentially acts in many ways psychologically like a toddler. That said, I'm pretty confident that, in fact, I've got the data to back this up. It's not just that pundits say it. I mean, you can argue that obviously Democrats say this, but surely they're in the political opposition. It's not surprising they would caricature the president. Sure, mainstream media pundits would say it, but presumably they're not particularly big fans of Trump. The data that I relied on in both the article and the book, however, comes not from those sources, but rather from people that you would automatically assume have a rooting interest in Donald Trump succeeding as president. Namely, I developed a Twitter thread beginning in April of 2017, and you can see the first tweet that started it on April 25th, that basically creates an addition to that thread if a Trump staffer, advisor, subordinate, GOP Hill staffer, GOP member of Congress, or an international treaty ally describes Donald Trump the way you would describe a petulant 2-year-old. I started this, as I said, in April of 2017. 3 years and close to 2 months later, I am now, I believe, at 1,450 examples, separate examples of this being reported in the mainstream media. There are plenty of anonymous quotes, and indeed the majority of additions to the thread and the majority of the examples are, of course, from anonymous quotes, because if you were to actually say this with attribution, Donald Trump would very likely fire you if you were if you were working for him. But it should be pointed out there are plenty of on-the-record quotes as well, in which even, again, Donald Trump's defenders nonetheless describe him the way you would describe an out-of-control toddler. My personal favorite is easily Lindsey Graham's. The president's he can be a handful. That's just the way it is. And, just to take a look at the additions of the Toddler-in-Chief thread by quarter, as you can see, this behavior isn't getting better. Donald Trump is not maturing as he grows into the office. Indeed, if anything, he's devolving. He's getting worse. This doesn't include the current quarter, but I can already tell you that it's going to break a new record. So when I say Donald Trump acts like a toddler, what am I talking about? Well, space constraints and time constraints prevent me from going into all of these particular traits, but these are the ones that are discussed in the book. I'm going to narrow it here to discussions of temper tantrums, poor impulse control, and short attention span. And I will try to add more recent examples since the article and the book were published, in particular about his response to the coronavirus outbreak, as well as to the recent surge of demonstrations in response to the killing of George Floyd. So in terms of temper tantrums, this is easily the most dominant Trump trait I've seen in terms of the data collection. Trump pretty much loses his temper if anyone sort of questions his opinion on anything. We have seen this with respect to the coronavirus outbreak. One of the reasons the United States was relatively slow in terms of responding to it was because Trump got angry when a CDC official named Nancy Messonnier in late February said flat out that we had community spread in the United States, and therefore we had to be prepared for a dramatic shift in the behavior of the United States because we were going to have to deal with a pandemic. Trump learned of this news as he was flying home from a state visit to India and was so angry about it that essentially the coronavirus task force, which wanted to recommend more severe restrictions and quarantines, in the end chose not to do so because they recognized, frankly, he was too angry to process it. Similarly, we've seen this response in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests. Trump was so upset about press reports that the Secret Service had secreted him in a White House bunker that you can argue this led to the attempt to clear out Lafayette Square across from the White House, which has been a disastrous public relations move for him. Similarly, in terms of short attention span, I have a colleague who interviewed with the Trump administration during the transition, or the Trump transition team, for a potentially high-ranking cabinet post. And that person described to me once meeting with Donald Trump as, it was a 1-hour meeting. The way he put it is that it was not a single 1-hour meeting, but rather 61-minute meetings in which Trump would fire off, questions that were not necessarily related to each other. Questions like, what is NATO's value, or what do you think of France, or how large is an aircraft carrier? Trump has such significant knowledge deficits when it comes to policy that he really does need to ask a lot of questions. The problem is he lacks the ability to focus when someone is trying to deliver him the answers. And we can see this again in terms of his response to both the coronavirus outbreak and Black Lives Matter. In terms of the coronavirus outbreak, Alex Azar, who is Secretary of Health and Human Services, tried to brief Trump about this in January to say that it was a serious issue. Trump immediately pivoted the meeting to from talking about the coronavirus to talking about vaping. And therefore, that was another missed opportunity. And again, one of the reasons that the Trump campaign has announced they're going to restart large-scale rallies beginning next Friday in Tulsa, Oklahoma. No one thinks in terms of public health that this is a great idea, but the White House has made it very clear in multiple reports that the reason they want to do this is that Trump is getting fidgety in the White House, much like a toddler who has essentially been told that he can't leave his room. And then in terms of poor impulse control, again, Donald Trump constantly reflects this. And the combination of his poor impulse control and access to a Twitter account usually means that he's going to tweet something that winds up being counterproductive in terms of his overall mission. We've seen this again with respect to the coronavirus outbreak, in which various officials and governors in the United States, including Republicans, have complained about Trump's tweets, sending mixed signals in terms of how the U.S. citizens should respond to the coronavirus outbreak. And we've also seen it in terms of why we had the fiasco in Lafayette Square a little less than 2 weeks ago, in no small part because Trump wanted to do something, and that was something, even if it was not necessarily the right thing to do. The result of all this is that you should think of Trump's staffers, even if they are ideologically simpatico with Trump, in the same way you should think of poorly paid daycare workers who have to deal with an unruly toddler, except in many ways, the White House staffers actually have it worse, because if you're running a daycare center and you have someone who's misbehaving, you at least are viewed by the toddler as presumably a caregiver or someone in authority. The problem is Donald Trump is the elected president of the United States, and there is no staffer that can exercise that kind of authority or control over him. And so as a result, you wind up with the highest burn rate in history in terms of staff, and you have truly exasperated subordinates. I think this is best captured in terms of the coronavirus in the form of Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's been the sort of leading epidemiologist on this, in response to an interview that he gave to a Science magazine when asked why was it that Trump was constantly having these White House press conferences in which everyone was in close quarters and violating social distancing. Fauci finally said, "I know, but what do you want me to do? I mean, seriously, let's get real. What do you want me to do?" And this is also, I believe, another example of this was the fact that Secretary of Defense Mark Esper was clearly prepared to resign last week when he made a public statement opposing Trump's invocation of the Insurrection Act, which hasn't happened yet, in an attempt to quell demonstrations. The combined effects of all of Trump's toddler-like behavior on U.S. foreign policy have been, to use a technical term, not good. Trump essentially disdains policy planning, and while policy planning is not the be-all, end-all, to quote Dwight Eisenhower, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And the problem is, and we've seen this in the response to both the coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter movement, an absolute failure of contingency planning by the administration. Furthermore, Trump, whenever he rages about something, inevitably creates higher audience costs for other countries or other actors to agree with him. Hence, I think the breakdown of the G7 summit that was planned for September. There is clearly an inability to credibly commit by Trump and an inability to credibly signal even when he does intend to take serious action. And you have a White House staff that is far more devoted to taking care of Donald Trump's whims than doing things like executing policy. Trump, throughout all of this, has demonstrated extremely weak decision-making qualities, but nonetheless has actually been able to get away with a fair amount. Now, I want to be clear, he hasn't been able to do everything. And indeed, the very fact that the Secretary of Defense was willing to resign suggests that there are limits to his power. But that said, Trump has discovered that he has fewer constraints on foreign affairs. With the help of the congressional wing of the GOP, he has been able to both remake the judiciary and attempt to deconstruct the administrative state. Trump's one sort of unique quality in which he's been able to truly sort of go past or go beyond past constraints is his willingness to disregard norms of presidential behavior. You could argue potentially this was eroding beforehand, but Trump really is on a next level here. And essentially any effort by Congress or anyone else to oppose him is essentially constrained or hamstrung by the partisan veto. So long as the Republican Party has 34 senators, and they have far more than that in the US Senate, it is almost impossible for Congress to constrain Trump's use of emergency powers. Since the article and book were published, I would argue that, again, his response to the coronavirus pandemic and his response to the Black Lives Matter protests simply, reinforce the things that I had said in the book and in the article. And indeed, in the book, I actually had a sentence at the end that says, based on Trump's behavior to date, I want to make sure I get this exactly correct. Based on Trump's behavior as cataloged in this book, the idea of Trump coping with a true crisis, a terrorist attack, a global pandemic, a great power clash with China is truly frightening. And although we, have long debates about whether or not political science should be predictive or not, I would say that prediction has largely held up. So in closing, I think the best analogy you can make to thinking about Trump's control of the presidency is think about someone trying to drive, in bad weather conditions on a twisty mountain road. The question is, will that car go over the cliff? And there are two checks or constraints on that car going over the cliff. One is the guardrails that are presumably would prevent a car from doing that if it were to slip off. And the second is the quality of the driver. And I would argue that within the United States, what we've learned about the presidency is that, in fact, the guardrails wore down long before Donald Trump came into office. What we only have appreciated with the Trump presidency is the fact that essentially what has prevented prior presidents from exceeding their authority, from, essentially occupying an even more powerful office, has been their own ability to drive the car. And so as a result, we have, in the end, an extremely weak man occupying an extremely powerful office in which it turns out that, by and large, Schlesinger is correct and Neustadt is wrong. And with that, I will be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I feel like I've learned a lot from it already. I've got a couple of questions, and then we'll turn over to some more questions from the Q&A. So my first question is about foreign policy, which you mentioned a little bit in your presentation, but also in your article. And I wanted to ask you about it because you mentioned it's one of the areas that is most affected by the lack of other government branches being in control. And I wondered if you could speak to this a little bit more and how and what this has looked like under the Trump administration.
Right. I mean, I think in some ways, one of the more interesting elements of the Trump foreign policy is, first of all, you can argue during the 2016 campaign, to the extent that Trump actually had ideas that he was campaigning on, they were largely grounded in foreign policy, in the belief that essentially the liberal international order, as we understand it, even though it was set up by the United States, was now working against the United States. And you've seen efforts by the Trump administration to essentially remake that order, whether it comes in terms of forcing NATO to make greater defense contributions, withdrawing from a whole bevy of international agreements, and essentially trying to rewrite the rules of the global economic game. The results of this, I think, have been fitful at best. Like a 2-year-old, Trump has been very good at destroying a lot of things and not very good at building other structures. So there's no denying that the Trump administration has weakened the WTO, has weakened the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and now weakened the entire international arms control regime. That said, what is interesting is that the Trump administration has been very bad at creating alternative or parallel structures, in no small part because very few allies are willing to go along with him. The other thing that has hamstrung, I would argue, Trump's foreign policy is this toddler-like nature of his essentially means that most other foreign interlocutors can't trust anyone else but Trump. So as a result, Trump has burned through a variety of secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, national security advisors. And the fundamental fact is that all of these people, when they say things, whether it's Angela Merkel or Kim Jong-un or what have you, they don't necessarily believe subordinates. They will only believe something is true if Trump says it. And furthermore, they won't even necessarily be completely convinced it's true if Trump says it, because Trump can change his mind. Think about the agreement that Trump reached with Putin about creating a joint cyber task force after one of their meetings, I believe, at the G20. The G20, I think, which less than 24 hours later, after Trump tweeted it, then tweeted a response saying, well, I guess we're not going to do it. So, this kind of inconstant nature means essentially that the U.S. ability to credibly commit under President Trump has been completely eroded.
Now, just to touch on something that you've mentioned as well in your presentation. Of course, the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, and they've now spread throughout the world. And there's been a lot of criticism of the Trump administration's response to this. And I was just wondering what you think we can expect from them in the next few months.
That's a great question. And the problem is the variance on this is massive. There is a narrative you can offer that says essentially the last Monday's effort to clear Lafayette Square was sort of the moment of brinksmanship where you can argue the U.S. has veered away from a cliff, where it was obvious that, and there were press reports that Trump wanted 10,000 active duty military troops in Washington, D.C. And what is striking, and this again shows his limitations and his weakness as a leader, is that was opposed by William Barr, Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and so forth. And in the end, he winds up not doing it. Now, it should be stressed that Trump has the power to do this. That hasn't changed. But it would be interesting, my hunch is if he tried to do it, he would have to deal with resignations from, among others, Esper and Milley, because and indeed this morning, I believe, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs literally issued a statement to his commanders acknowledging that he made a mistake in terms of accompanying Trump to St. John's Church for the photo op right afterwards. So it suggests that Trump's ability to call on military and paramilitary forces to deal with demonstrations is going to be limited. And a related element of this, by the way, is the fact that over the last 2 weeks, without denying that there's been violence, the violence has also been drowned out by, I would argue, the tremendously peaceful nature of the majority of protesters. And that's been interesting to see. And it also has caused a dramatic shift in public opinion in which, an overwhelming majority of Americans sympathize to some extent with the Black Lives Matter movement at this point. Now, there's disagreements about what that would mean going forward, but I believe it means that if Trump tried to use force right now, it would actually make things worse and not better, which does not mean that he might not try. He's clearly, he might try that if he thought, and it should be made very clear that everything Donald Trump does between now and November should be looked at through the frame of whether or not he thinks it will get him reelected. But the truth is that I think the most damning statement about the Trump administration so far has been that there was some pressure within the White House staff for Trump to give a larger statement on what race relations should look like in the United States. And the fact is that's been scotched because everyone recognizes within the White House that is not something that Donald Trump is good at. He's not good at reading from prepared text. And indeed, his speech on the coronavirus back in April would be the best example of that. So I would expect that the Trump administration's response on this is going to be bad. My hope is that it is not violent.
Now, the next question actually touches on exactly something that you mentioned just now, which is what are the odds of Trump being reelected?
The answer here, I think, is not good, actually. I believe The Economist just started they've just started their sort of prediction model for the November 2020 election. I think they have, at this point, if the election were held now, Joe Biden would have a 5 in 6 chance of getting elected, and Donald Trump only a 1 in 6 chance. The truth is that there are two ways you can forecast this election. One is in terms of sort of fundamentals, and one is in terms of polling. If you look at the fundamentals, Donald Trump is not in a good position because, among other things, the economy is in no way the same shape that it was back in 2016. You have record high levels of unemployment. You're going to have negative economic growth. It is possible you will then have a growing economy after that. So maybe by come October and November, things will look better. But that said, I think people are underestimating the effects of a second wave of the coronavirus pandemic within the United States. You're already seeing, even in summer conditions when you would have expected the spread to be not that great, you're seeing infection rates rise in, I think, something like 20 states at this point. So a fundamentals model would say that Donald Trump will lose. The polling also at this point shows that Donald Trump will lose. Now, a lot of people are obviously, how do I put this, traumatized by what happened in 2016, given sort of polling and nature of the fundamentals model. But I would point out two things. First, the sort of economic fundamentals model, or that most political scientists have developed, actually got the 2016 election pretty close to right in terms of the popular vote. It was the distribution of that popular vote that made things slightly different. The second thing is that if you look at the poll, if you compare Joe Biden's polling performance against Donald Trump with Hillary Clinton's performance during the same time, there were moments when Clinton had something like a 10-point lead. What there weren't, however, were moments where Hillary Clinton topped 50% in polls. And what's interesting is that Joe Biden, over the last week or so, has easily cleared 50% in polling in all the sort of quality polling that you've seen. Now, we're still in June, and there's 5 months left, and 5 months ago, we were just starting to appreciate the coronavirus might be a thing. So obviously a lot can happen, but I think at this point, simply put, and I say this speaking in the United States, as someone who obviously does not think Donald Trump should be reelected, cards on the table, I think the American people have just had enough of this. They're just exhausted. I paraphrase Donald Trump, we're sick and tired of all the winning.
We've got a question here from Ben, and he asks, do you think the traditional constitutional checks and balances have been irrevocably undermined, or do you think Trump is a scary exception?
I think it's a little bit of both. There are ways in which Donald Trump is an exception. I mean, as I said, there are actions he has taken, and furthermore attempted to take, in which that no president prior to him really has, with the possible, I guess, partial exception of Andrew Johnson. The difference, the disturbing thing, I think, is that what this presidency has revealed has been the power of political polarization to essentially undercut what we think of as the constitutional checks. Again, traditionally, when past presidents have tried to exceed this kind of authority, think Andrew Johnson or think Richard Nixon, Congress has responded by essentially passing a series of measures to try to constrain the power of the president. The difference this time around is that, in contrast to 1974, Democrats do not overwhelmingly control the House and Senate, and there isn't, there's more ideological polarization within the parties. Democrats are further to the left and Republicans are way, way, way further to the right. So even if 2020 winds up being a blowout election, Democrats are not going to have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. And so the interesting question is going to be, and I make this argument in the book, is whether or not you're going to see efforts to child-proof the presidency, which is what you want to do is essentially make sure that an adult president can implement, emergency powers in such a way that they have to if there's a natural disaster or if there's a war, what have you. But you want to make it challenging for someone that lacks that decision-making capacity. And so I think it'll be very interesting to see if there's a Biden administration, the extent to which Biden and Democrats try to do that. Because part of the problem is that, generally speaking, the party out of power in the executive branch always winds up talking about excessive executive power right up until the moment that they then occupy the office, and then suddenly they manage to flip. So I will be amused, because I guarantee you that if Biden wins the presidency, you are suddenly going to see Republicans develop a newfound appreciation for legislative checks on executive power.
We've actually got a couple of questions which build on this and look at sort of the celebrity power and whether or not a president like Trump is something that we should get used to seeing in the future.
That's a valid question, in that Trump, to some extent, Trump won. I think one of the fundamental reasons Trump won the GOP nomination, and this in some ways was the most surprising element of this, is that in a field of 17 candidates, the fact that he had significant star power and that he was articulating a position that resonated with the Republican base made it possible for him to win the presidency. That said, I honestly think this is a function of whether Trump wins or loses in November. One of the problems in terms of articulating how we interpret the Trump presidency is whether it is seen as a success or a failure. And right now it's still seen as a success because Trump was viewed as an upset winner in the 2016 election. That he won despite polling that suggested that he was going to lose, even though, by the way, fundamental models actually suggested it was going to be a very close race. And if he loses, the narrative that is eventually going to emerge, I suspect, is, it turns out celebrities aren't that great of an idea as president. Indeed, if you have someone like, let's say, Oprah Winfrey or The Rock decide that they want to run into the presidency, people will point to Trump as an example of this is why we don't allow celebrities. And so I really do think this is the hinge question is does Trump win a second term or not?
Thanks very much. We've got another foreign policy question here, which sort of builds on, it sort of looks at multilateralism and what successes you've seen of middle power states still being able to sort of continue an international sphere where multilateralism works, considering what Trump has been doing.
I think you've seen efforts at that. I mean, obviously, in terms of the Paris climate change accords, that would certainly be one example. I would also add that there have been many sort of small and middle range states that have handled the coronavirus much better than any of the great powers, not just the United States, but China, Russia, and if you think of the European Union as a single actor, certainly the EU. That said, and this is the realist in me, I guess, I cannot stress enough the fact that these are second best approaches. They are better than nothing, but the simple fact is you are not going to address climate change unless you have US and Chinese buy-in. You are not going to be able to address necessarily the coronavirus unless you get US and Chinese buy-in. There are certain, I'm developing a course for next year entitled The End of the World and What Comes After, about systemic catastrophes in world politics. And one of the things that one of my takeaways as I'm developing the syllabus is that it is certainly possible that smaller actors and middle range powers can begin a movement or can try to shift global norms and or global rules of the game. In the end, unless you have great power buy-in, these efforts will stall out.
We've got a couple more questions about the November elections. One here from Andrew who asks, how solid is Trump's base? And if he loses, will he leave office or declare himself a winner? And there's just another question that follows on this and sort of asks, what are the checks and balances in place to prevent this happening?
Okay, these are excellent questions, and I'm going to preface my remarks by pointing out that my area of expertise is international relations, not just and to the extent that I study American politics, mostly about foreign policy. So I might warn people that they should read widely on this beyond what I'm saying. In terms of Trump's base, again, the key thing to realize is political polarization, which means he's probably going to get at least 40% of the vote, no matter what the scenario. Consider what Trump has, said in the last 2 weeks alone in terms of clearing out peaceful protests in Lafayette Square, in terms of accusing a 75-year-old protester in Buffalo of somehow being an agent of Antifa, whatever the hell that is. And then yesterday he tweeted something about declaring that the U.S. would never rename forts like Fort Bragg or Fort Lee, which are named after loser Confederate war generals, because somehow that would be a violation of America's heritage. These are not popular moves by any stretch of the imagination. And indeed, what's interesting is that if you look at polling, even large elements of Trump's base acknowledge he should get off Twitter and not do certain things. That said, we are still a highly polarized country. And so despite, mishandling the coronavirus, having an economic contraction more severe than any in a century, and not being able to cope with Black Lives Matter, Trump is still polling in the high 30s and low 40s. That is roughly his floor. And many Americans, and I think friends elsewhere, find this incredibly depressing. Their argument is Trump can do anything and he's still going to get 40% of the country. There is another way to look at this, which is he has a very high floor. He also has a ridiculously low ceiling, which is, my hunch is the very best that Donald Trump can do in terms of the vote percentage is 45%. That he's operating within a very narrow band. And indeed, if you look at the polling, that is pretty much where he has been. The one brief exception was during the immediate beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, where he got a very modest but real rally around the flag bump. Now, as to whether Donald Trump will leave the White House, I confess I'm more optimistic than most on this. I think the answer is yes, he will. in part because if Donald Trump loses, it's not just going to be a loss that affects him. It's going to be a loss that affects the GOP writ large. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that if he loses, the GOP loses the Senate as well. And then it becomes a question of whether other elements of the GOP power structure decide, are they willing to go full authoritarian, or do they recognize that that would probably be a disastrous course of action for the United States? And it's also worth remembering that an awful lot of the US electoral machinery is not governed by the federal government. It's governed by the states. And so a lot of the sort of key states that will have to send in electoral college votes are not run by Republicans. They're run by Democrats, which doesn't therefore mean it's a machine and you don't have to worry, it's in the bag for Democrats. But what it means is that mucking around with these sort of vote tallies, I think, is going to be difficult. The one wild card on this is that because of the coronavirus, you are likely to see a much larger share of the vote come in by mail, which means that the one thing that I think will be different in November 2020 is that traditionally in presidential elections, we've known the winner the night of the election. But in a lot of cases, the sort of mail-in vote is going to be so large that it very well might tip the balance in some of these swing states. So unless there is an overwhelming landslide, it is possible we won't know the winner on election night. And then the question becomes, how does the country cope with that degree of uncertainty? But I've lived long enough so that I remember the 2000 election as well. And if there's a concern I have, it's that it starts to get litigated. But that would be the only way that would happen is if it turned out to be such a close election that a legal strategy akin to what happened in 2000 could actually put Donald Trump, bring him across the finish line. And at this point, at least, we're not there.
We've got a question here from Abdul, who asks, what has been the best method that people have used for dealing with Trump? And states, despite Trump's unconventional personality, this method might be useful when dealing with other narcissistic leaders.
Well, my initial gut response is that I don't recommend alcohol really as a response to anything, because that's the way a lot of Americans have coped with this, let's be honest. In terms of more seriously, the fundamental advantage of democracy in theory is that failed leaders fail, that they are, they don't stay in power. One of the things that I think has been fascinating over the Trump years has been watching the array of both domestic and international counterparts to Trump try a welter of different strategies in terms of coping with him. So we think about Emmanuel Macron essentially buttering him up constantly and offering praise. Think of Angela Merkel, dealing with him much more sternly. To be honest, very few of these things seem to work either way. The fact is Trump is such a narcissist and so inconstant that the only thing that does seem to work is literally treating him the way you would have treated, Kim Jong-un, which is, think about the trip to Saudi Arabia in 2017, where the Saudis put on a massive show. Or think about China's Tiananmen Square, Forbidden Palace presentation. Trump was clearly blown away by these things. And so there is a way in which treating him personally like he's the greatest leader ever to walk the face of the earth might butter him up a little. But it is worth noting that even in those instances, it's not necessarily the case that Trump will always give, what these foreign leaders want in terms of policy. That certainly hasn't been the case with China. Maybe you can argue it's been the case with Saudi Arabia. That might be the best example of success. And, even in the case of North Korea, where Trump invested very much in personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, in the end, he didn't agree to a deal that would have been ridiculously disadvantageous to the United States. And so I think the fundamental fact is there is no great strategy of coping with him. The only strategy is just riding out the storm until he's gone from the stage.
Just one last question, and I think this one speaks to your conclusion of your presentation. What guardrails do you imagine will be put up over the next few years to sort of limit the power of the presidency, if any?
I suspect you will see a couple of particular laws be reformed or be amended by Congress as a way of preventing further presidential malfeasance. One is, I suspect you'll see a law passed that requires the president to make his taxes public. This was something that goes back to 2016, and again is an example of a norm that was violated. I think that will be passed with relative ease. There might be reform of the Federal Vacancies Act. This has been a law that has essentially allowed Trump to rely on acting officials to an unprecedented degree, and as a result, essentially gotten figures that he wanted running agencies like the Defense Department. A third might be a reform of the Emergencies Act, the 1976 law, and its concomitant Emergency International Economic Powers Act, which allows the president to essentially impose sanctions and/or declare states of emergency with relative ease. Again, I don't think these things are going to be revoked. I think these laws are going to be amended essentially to enable Congress, or to essentially either limit the time in which the president can use these things and/or give Congress additional checks such that they have better oversight. That is my hope, at least. I don't know if that'll actually happen.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. I think it was really, really brilliant and good to get your views also on what's likely to happen for the rest of the year. So thank you very much. And thank you so much to all our participants today and for your brilliant questions.
Thank you all for the great questions. It was a pleasure.
Thanks very much. Have a wonderful day.